In the previous screencast, we used the curl command line tool to directly exercise the HTTP RESTful API for the movie database. In this screencast, we'll see another way to do it by using a volunteer-provided Ruby gem that wraps the API in a way that's more idiomatic to use in a Ruby program. Here we are at the home page for the movie database, and if I click on API and I scroll down in the documentation, one of the sections is wrappers and libraries. There's a list of programming languages for which various volunteers have written wrapper libraries that make it easier to use the RESTful API. You can see there's two different choices for Ruby. We're going to use this Ruby gem contributed by a volunteer. Clicking on the link takes us to its homepage on GitHub. As is pretty common for Ruby gems, the gem itself is hosted on rubygems.org, so that when you type gem install, you should be able to install it with no additional command line arguments. But the gem source code is available publicly on GitHub so that others can contribute. We're going to experiment with this gem directly from the IRB Ruby command line interpreter, but remember that if you wanted to use it in a Rails application, you would have to add it to the gem file, as the text in the book reminds us. Recall that in the RESTful API, we had to first sign up for an API key to include with every request, and then we would make requests and get back resources, like movies, in return. Similarly, the gem is structured along the same lines. If we scroll down through the documentation, we can see that there's a call to set the API key, and if we scroll down a little bit further, a list of the different resources encapsulated by the gem. For example, the movie resource allows us to dereference all of these different attributes of a movie, which map directly to the attributes we saw in the JSON object when we experimented with the API using curl. The documentation for the gem shows us that there's a convenient find method that lets us retrieve movies matching a specific title. There's also a separate method called detail that gives us detailed information about a particular movie, and as we'll see, the ID attribute, which is one of the attributes returned as the result of the simplified find call, has to be passed to the detail method in order to get that detailed information. First, make sure the gem is installed. We're using version 0.0.17, and in a Rails app, you would just specify this version in the gem file rather than having to install the gem manually. Once the gem is installed, we can fire up the Ruby Interactive Command Line Interpreter and load the gem. Following the documentation, we can use the simplified find call in the API to search for movies by title. The return value certainly looks and quacks like an array whose individual elements we can inspect. We can look at individual attributes for each of those results, and as we'll see, in order to get movie details, we need to look at the ID attribute and pass that to another API call, the movie detail call. With this call, we can get much more detailed information about each movie. These are the calls that we'll use when we integrate the API with our Rotten Potatoes application. So far, we've only covered the happy path. What happens if something goes wrong when calling a remote service? For example, in our case, trying to call the API without having a valid API key. If we try this experiment interactively, we can see that it raises an exception, although the exception doesn't appear to have anything to do with the remote service. To understand this behavior, I looked at the source code for the TMDb gem, and I found that it relies on another gem, HTTParty, to handle the actual HTTP communication. According to the documentation and source code for HTTParty, it keeps track of the server's response to the most recent API call. Going back to the code for the TMDb gem, I found that this response is actually saved and made available as a class variable of the class TMDb API. And sure enough, if we inspect the value of that class variable after the call that raised an exception in our experiment, we can see that there is an HTTP response code of 401, which, if we look it up in the HTTP response code documentation, represents an unauthorized error, which makes a lot of sense given that we tried to make the call without a valid API key. As we develop this example in the book, we'll catch this exception and turn it into something more meaningful for the application programmer to use.